I'm Veronica Frenkel, President of Pathways Consulting. Thank you for being here today, and a special thank you to Dave, Kevin, and Jody and NCET for having me here to have one of my favorite conversations about some of my least favorite conversations, the difficult ones. I think many of us would like to have a pretty tough conversation with Mother Nature right about now regarding the smoke, the virus, and the challenges that we face. And I hope all of you and your loved ones are faring well and too blessed to be stressed and taking good care of yourselves amidst these challenging times. I'm going to start my screen, and I'll look forward to a thumbs up from someone just to make sure that we can see it. So we're here to talk about difficult conversations because, well, we face them a lot, just about every day. And studies show that we face 5 difficult situations, most of them difficult conversations, every single day. The vast majority of our tense moments have to do with breakdowns in communication, in our professional and personal lives. It could be with our families, could be at work, could be shopping, it could be in any number of places that we face them. Sometimes we face a tough situation about a sensitive issue that we dread talking about and we're holding back. Or we find ourselves in a conversation and poof, all of a sudden it becomes challenging and difficult. And I'm sure you don't look forward to them any more than I do. And handling difficult conversations well is a lot like treading into the unknown, hence the slide, hence the title, To Boldly Go. For you Trekkies out there, I hope you appreciate it. It's like going into terrain that we really don't know what's going to happen and what we're going to find. And these moments can strike fear in the hearts of the uninitiated and most of us. Experts say that the ability to handle these conversations well and communicate effectively, especially during those tough moments, is the key to organizational success, leadership success, and our team's success, and can drive our results tremendously. So it's important that we learn how to manage these ever-present, pesky, challenging moments, practice the skills that can help us stay in dialogue so we can work towards solutions and find results with others collaboratively. Let me share a little bit about how I come to this conversation. I am the owner of Pathways Consulting, as I mentioned before. My business helps small and medium-sized companies improve their bottom line by strengthening the capacity of leaders at all levels, especially their ability to deal with common people challenges, things like conflict, team issues, performance management, employee engagement, and change management. Our portfolio of services, as you see on the slide, includes coaching, training, around employee and leadership development. I do team facilitation and a lot of organizational development consulting. I've worked in HR and OD and training for about the last 20 years. And in my 3 different careers, I think the theme that runs through all of them is a passion for helping people work together to find solutions to common problems. And being able to communicate well during tough moments is really a key part of that. And I have been passionate about this topic for a really long time. I work on issues that are important to me and challenge me. And I often say I teach what I need to remember. And practicing strategies for handling difficult conversations is no exception because I'm faced with them every day. In fact, just yesterday, I had a situation where I had a conflict with an event I was working on scheduling. And I contacted the organizer and I said, can we look at other options? And the text response that I got back was just, no, I'm sorry. And I realized that that's not necessarily opening the door to conversation. And I found myself reacting. And I was so glad I was preparing for today because it really helped me remember to practice what I teach, which I commonly say to myself. And so I took a breath. I thought, how can I handle this? And I was able to work with that person and the other organization that I had a conflict with to figure out a solution. The other place where I feel like I've learned the most about difficult conversations and had to use a lot of these skills was as a mom. And for those of you who have teenage children, I've survived those teenage years. My daughter is now 22, but I can remember using these skills a lot and being reminded by my daughter, who I taught these to, regularly, that I needed to practice them. Always be careful what you teach your kids. So I'm really glad to be here today to practice with you and to learn again with you. And I know many of you have a lot of skills in these areas, and I hope this adds to your toolbox, reinforces your toolbox, or refreshes what you already know. So here's what we're going to discuss today. First, we're going to spend a little bit of time discussing what are those difficult conversations, what makes them difficult, and some examples of some that you might find challenging in your work environment and why they're important. Then we're going to reveal the greatest obstacle to communication and dialogue and the culprit for so many of these conversations becoming difficult. Just understanding this can really help us as we navigate these tough conversations. Then we're going to spend the bulk of our time reviewing some helpful strategies. There's many out there, and I'm going to cover a few and hit the highlights on some really important ones that can help us get unstuck in tough conversations, manage our emotions, stay in dialogue so we have a better chance of building understanding with the other person and finding solutions in a collaborative and respectful way. The approach I'm sharing with you today is derived in part from the brilliant book, Crucial Conversations, which I encourage you to read if you haven't already done so. This approach is very rich, and I offer many longer workshops on the topic using this model, including through extended studies. Thank you, Jody. My goal for you is to walk away with some gems from that approach and some other tools and tips I've learned along the way. I'm going to ask you to have a piece of paper and a pen handy. I'm going to ask you to participate in an exercise here shortly, and also to reflect on a situation yourself and jot down a few notes about it. And we will have a surprise related to participation in today's session. So I encourage you to participate in the chat box when I ask for you to do that. So let's jump in. What are difficult conversations? We kind of know when we're in them, but what makes these conversations different than those plain vanilla conversations, which are so much easier? What we know is that a crucial conversation is a discussion that's characterized by three things: high stakes, strong emotions, and opposing viewpoints. Something about the topic is important to us and important to the other person. So the stakes are high for one or both of us, or maybe if there's more people, there's a lot of stakes involved. That often brings up some emotion for folks, and we're going to talk about what some of those emotions are and how that happens. But usually the emotions get heightened in that conversation, and there's generally opposing viewpoints. One person wants one thing or thinks one way, the other person wants something else. We have a conflict, and it doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad, but because it's high stakes and there's emotions involved, it can go down a slippery slope pretty quickly. Now, we all have these communication opportunities, I like to call them, every single day, and we may feel stuck in an ongoing conversation with a colleague and unable to work through it. We've had it several times, and we find ourselves revisiting it. Or we may find ourselves saying, why don't others just get what I'm trying to say? Or why does that person always just immediately shut me down when I'm trying to get my point across in the meeting? How come it seems so impossible for us to move forward and move to constructive dialogue? Not everyone on the team maybe is not pulling their weight, and you have to have a conversation with a team member, a peer that you have, or if one of your direct reports. Somebody interrupts you regularly during a Zoom team meeting, which happens a lot, and Zoom meetings are even harder when it comes to that. And your supervisor maybe hasn't followed up with you about a request you made a couple of weeks ago. You've bugged them once and you haven't heard a thing, and you're starting to get kind of frustrated. And there's many in our personal lives. Your teenager barely listens to you, is on social media too much, and their grades are starting to slip. Your next door neighbor just got two Irish setters. Lovely as they are, they bark a lot and sometimes leap over your joint fence and leave gifts in your yard. And maybe your spouse or significant other is spending far too much time at work, and each time you try to bring it up, it turns into a heated argument. When we have these conversations, we may feel like this. Now, you may see yourself in some of those many faces on that slide. Those emotions might look familiar, and I'm sure that you've experienced many of them, much more than one of them. And sometimes we just want to do this. I always have to find a way to use this slide in a training because I just love this slide because it illustrates so well that sometimes we just want to throw up our hands, and it's the most stressful part of our professional lives. Some studies show that 70 to 80% of the challenges that CEOs face have to do with human beings and the difficult conversations they need to have with them or are trying to have with them. I coach several executives and leaders at all levels, and my experience aligns with this number. I would say, and the other coaches on this call might agree, that at least 75% of what we work on in coaching has to do with conversations they need to have or are struggling with around quality, performance, missed deadlines, team issues, relationships, safety violations, team behaviors in meetings, change management, announcing changes, and so much more. And it's not just the CEOs. As a team facilitator, my experience has shown me that teams begin to achieve greater performance when they are able to talk through these difficult moments, when they can bring their differences to the table, get real, get honest, and find solutions together. Now, I want to give you a chance to think about the conversations that might be most difficult for you. Now, there's many others that are not on this list, but I am going to share some of these. And if the ones that are most challenging for you are not on this list, just make a note of that for yourself and ask yourself which ones are. So I'm going to ask you to pick one of these if you have to think about which one is most challenging. We've got a few options here for those who are watching after the fact: performance feedback, giving feedback to a direct report with a performance issue, relationships, working through differences with another person or trying to strengthen a relationship, diversity inclusion, discussing challenges with diversity and inclusion. And for those of you who are taking the poll, go ahead and answer. I see results coming in. We've got meetings, speaking up when things get off track or getting interrupted during a meeting, and someone's being disruptive. Safety issues, safety violations, or team issues regarding colleagues not following through, not getting you what you need. I'm going to keep the poll up here for about 10 more seconds and let you answer. So we got a good number of folks that have answered. All right, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. Now, there's no right or wrong to this. I mean, we all face different ones, and hopefully what you find here is you're not alone in facing the challenges that you face. And hopefully it's bringing front of mind a few of the challenges that may prove to be more difficult for you. Some of the conversations that might be challenging for you to have. So I'm closing that poll. Did I stop sharing the results? Just want to make sure. Okay. Many problems in our workplaces occur because of some of these issues and other issues, and because of our inability to handle them well. And we generally have a few options when we face difficult conversations. The reality is we have three basic options. There's really only three things that we can choose to do. One is avoid them. And we'll see in a moment that a lot of people do. Many withdraw, hoping that the conflict will just go away or things will get better and they'll keep things stable. Maybe we face them and handle them poorly. We step up and we find ourselves unprepared to handle them, ill-prepared to handle it well. We may raise our voice, we may get angry, we may shut down. It's not going well when we try to handle it. And the third option, which we all aspire to, is to face them and handle them well. And let's be honest, when we try to deal with them, most of us swing between two ends of this unhealthy continuum. We avoid them in some way, or we face them and we push too hard, and we may exacerbate the situation. This happens for a variety of reasons. First, we may be uncomfortable dealing with conflict. Nature kind of works against us. As human animals, we're not wired to respond to these tough situations. And I'll return to this in a moment. So handling these tough situations and scary moments doesn't come naturally or without effort to us. We may misunderstand the conflict and our role within it. Maybe we get caught off guard in the middle of a conversation that can catch us by surprise, and we can have a knee-jerk reaction and later ask ourselves, oh my God, what was I thinking? Why did I say that? Why did I react that way? I think I just made it worse. And this reaction we sometimes have can be self-defeating, and we act in ways either withdrawing or even pushing too hard or raging that keep us from getting what we want, and we can become our own worst enemy. And the last reason that we struggle with these conversations and may not handle them well is we might not have developed the communication and dialogue skills to help us have the conversation we need to have with the other person to move toward collaboration. We sometimes don't know where to start, and we just dive right in. Some statistics that reinforce if you are one that responds in some of these ways, you won't find yourself too alone here. Whether it's due to fear of retaliation, a negative effect on the relationship, lack of training or ability to do it, an overwhelming number of people are avoiding tough conversations. 70% say that they avoid difficult conversations with their boss, coworker, or direct reports. Now, the fallout of this isn't pretty. In fact, other studies show that the cost of every single conversation failure is $7,500 and more than 7 workdays. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it from an ROI standpoint. The ability to handle these conversations well is really important. Employees spend 2.8 hours a week dealing with difficult situations, amounting to approximately $359 billion in paid hours. That's a lot of money, and we hope that they can handle them well so we can get results from that investment of time and energy. For many people, including my clients and myself, the inability to step up and handle these conversations may be keeping them or may have kept them from advancing in their careers, and an obstacle to how others perceive them and their performance. Like I always like to say, sometimes the key to unlocking our success, our team's success, is a crucial conversation that we need to have that maybe we're not having. So here's the moment that I'd like to ask you to think about a tough situation. I want to make this real for you so that you can apply this to a situation you're currently in or have been in. So maybe it's a tough conversation that you need to have with the person that you're regularly running into issues with or trying to communicate with, or a situation you regularly find yourself stuck in, or a relationship that's frustrating or annoying to you in some way. Or you can look backwards. Think if you've had a conversation, you might have had it today or in the last week that didn't go well. And either you or the other person became pushy, or it escalated, or one of you shut down, and the result, you didn't get to a solution. So I want you to just take a few moments, I'm going to give you a few seconds to jot down so you can identify a situation either that you're in right now and need to have, or one that you had in the past. Just take a couple minutes, just take a couple seconds and jot something down on your piece of paper. We all have them. And by thinking about this situation as we move through the rest of the workshop, it'll help you. Hopefully you'll be able to think about how you can apply one or more of the strategies we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to check in with you at the end of the workshop to see if it helped at all. So before exploring what makes difficult conversations so, well, difficult, I want to spend a little time looking at the communication and dialogue process by introducing you to a dialogue model, which will remind us why communication is so important and what we're trying to accomplish. Now, this is the dialogue model from the book, Crucial Conversations. And in the center of the model, you see the goal of communication, the goal of dialogue. It is creating what they call and what we call a pool of shared meaning. By shared, we don't necessarily mean that people agree, but there is understanding of each other's points of view. Now you'll notice on each side, me and the other person, we go through a reasoning process, which I'm going to break down in a different way here in just a few minutes, in order to share and speak and act in a way that contributes to that pool of shared knowledge, shared meaning. Now, successful dialogue starts when everyone feels safe enough to share their meaning and add their meaning into that pool. And there's enough safety to offer a protective barrier of sorts. Imagine if we didn't have a barrier on a pool and didn't add water to it, it would dry up in our lovely state of Nevada. So you can imagine that as a barrier protecting a pool. So safety is really important. And the key points here that I want to make is that the more willingly that people share information, the larger the pool of information. And the larger the pool of information, the more information we have there, we are better prepared to make decisions and get results. It's this reservoir of common information, this shared meaning that fuels effective choices and decisions, motivates people to act on those decisions. It builds relationships, it drives team performance, and it's critical to our organizations. Now, dialogue is different from how we generally handle crucial conversations or difficult conversations in two ways. We give up the goal of convincing the other person. In fact, they say when we stop convincing or trying to convince, we can actually become more convincing. So we give up the goal of trying to convince and or withdrawing from the conversation to avoid a conflict. We take responsibility for sharing our information into the pool, but also making sure that the other person is getting their information and their thoughts and ideas and perspectives into that pool, even those who disagree with us. However, unfortunately, when we're facing a tough conversation, we may withdraw or hold back, or we may insist, demand, or coerce. Why do we behave that way? To best understand that, we have to acknowledge the greatest obstacle to communication and dialogue, and we're going to talk about that now. And the way I'm going to introduce you to that is we're going to play a little game. I'm going to illustrate that through a quick game. You're about to see some letters on the slide. Using your pen and your piece of paper, I would like you to write 2 words using those letters. So my instructions are, write 2 words using those letters. All right, so I am going to bring up the correct answer. I asked you to write 2 words using those letters. What happened? I asked you to do it fairly clearly, right? However, your mind added meaning to what I asked you to do and took it in a different direction. You probably thought or interpreted my instructions as I was asking you to sort of play an anagram game and come up with as many 2-word pairs as you could possibly come up with, right? And what got in the way of you hearing what I asked you to do was this most important obstacle that we have, this very powerful tool between our ears, our brain. Our brains work fast. Our unconscious brain processes millions of bits of information every second. Now, I've seen studies that show we process 11 million bits of information every second. I've heard others say up to 100 or 120 million bits of information. I personally don't know how the neurologists count them, but let's just say it's a lot. And our brains are busy processing unconsciously all the time. And to help us survive that bombardment, our brains form mental models about the world that help us manage, organize, process information quickly and unconsciously, since our conscious brain can't manage it all. In fact, studies also show our conscious brain can only process 50. Now, that's not 50,000 or 50 million, it's 50. And so when we're being bombarded by all those data bits of information, our conscious brain can only focus on 50, but our unconscious brain is doing a lot of work behind the scenes to manage it all. So when someone is communicating with us, this powerful brain of ours starts working. We focus, we sort, we interpret, we assume, like you did in this exercise. This is all normal, and don't expect that your brain won't. You need it to. But this process could make our brain add information or meaning to the situation or to what the other person is saying that could lead us to misinterpret what's actually happening and what the person is actually trying to say to us and their intent. These stories, as we'll talk about, the way that we interpret can drive the feelings we have, further adding additional misinformation that can only deepen the miscommunication. Now, this is when the other person is talking to us. However, when we're doing the talking, the other person's brain is doing the exact same thing. And it is a miracle that we understand each other at all, because our brains are constantly doing this processing and adding of meaning all the time. It's amazing we hear each other at all. Now, I want to look at this mental process a little bit differently using another tool from the organizational development, organizational psychologist, Krista Argyris. And it's ladder of inference. And it takes those 4 steps that I was talking about for me and the other person going into the pool and kind of flips it up like a ladder. Now, what happens is something occurs in our midst, an event. There's something that happens or is said or someone does. And we immediately think that we just react to it. And that what happened drives our reaction, and we responded in the only way we could. Now, so for example, let's say I'm in a meeting. I share a suggestion. The facilitator of the meeting doesn't respond, doesn't acknowledge it, and just keeps talking about their idea. Now, I could just decide to interrupt them or talk over them or talk louder. And I may say, that's the only thing that's the only thing I could do, right? Because she wasn't acknowledging my comment. But there are a few important steps that our brains go through in milliseconds before we react. Again, the first thing we do is we filter, and our conscious brain takes those 50 bits of data and we pick the ones to focus on. That is the very first thing that our brains does. It does a filter our brains do. It's a filter of sorts. This is the key step, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later, but we tell a story, we draw conclusions, we make assumptions about what's happening in that conversation or in that situation based on what they're saying or doing. So in that meeting example that I gave, the story I could tell myself, the interpretation that I could tell is that, you know what? She doesn't care about my idea. She disrespects me. She doesn't appreciate my value. I could tell any number of stories, which are then going to drive my feelings. Feelings and motives are pretty closely linked because how I feel about it is going to change what I want to accomplish with what I'm about to say or do. So my motives may shift along with them. So these stories drive our feelings, shift our motives. So I feel angry and frustrated. And so I just blurt right back out over her when she's talking. I interrupt her and I talk loudly. Now I'm going to walk through some longer examples a little bit later. But the thing to know is our brain is so skilled at thinking and interpreting that we jump up this ladder without knowing it. In fact, I taught this to my daughter when she was a teenager, and she still reminds me that every now and then I'm jumping up a few rungs on the ladder, which is a great expression to use. And if you introduce your teams to this, they can also start to say that, whoa, I think you're jumping up a couple of rungs on the ladder, and help each other slow it down and unpack your thinking and reasoning. But the context we're in, the assumptions we make, and our accumulated experience really channel how much and how quickly we jump up this ladder and what we do when we get to the top. These skills at reasoning are essential to our lives and our living with all of the information we have to manage with our brains, but they can also get us into trouble. So this, my friends, is the greatest obstacle to managing these difficult conversations, to actually communicating well, and it is between our ears. So noticing it, paying attention to it can really help us. In high stakes conversations, what happens? Well, that story we're telling is likely that we're threatened in some way. And so we may withdraw or hold back, and our brains basically drive our bodies to defend themselves. Doing anything different than that is not instinctual. It actually takes work, and here's why. We're genetically wired and evolutionary developed in a way that weakens our brain in this moment. As humans, we evolved to survive attacks from threats, warring tribes, saber-toothed tigers, other dangerous things. As you know, we were early in our years as a species. They helped us escape and survive, because when threatened by a saber-toothed tiger, our brains, our amygdala, sends a message to the brain and says, produce adrenaline and cortisol, send it to the large muscle groups, as well as produce blood and send that to the large muscle groups, so we can do one of two things: fight or flee. We got to run, or we got to stand and defend ourselves. So today, when we perceive ourselves to be threatened, even though it's not a saber-toothed tiger that we're facing anymore, our brain doesn't know that. What's threatened might be our controls, our self-esteem, our respect, our sense of competence, our position, our control, and our brains still react the same way. Blood flows to the frontal cortex. The blood flow to the frontal cortex decreases, and decreasing the amount of oxygen to the brain right in the moment when we need it the most, when we need to think about what steps to take and what to do going forward. Other sciences show that our perceptual vision, when we're aroused in this way, when we're threatened, goes from 180 degrees to 30 degrees, because we really want to focus on that saber-toothed tiger. And so part of what happens is our ability to see options and see a way forward also decreases. In all the current stressors in our midst, psychologists are telling us that people's state of arousal and feeling threatened is pretty constant right now, with a lot of uncertainty. So these difficult conversations are more likely to happen because people are perceiving threats more quickly than maybe they would in normal times. So it's not a surprise if you're finding that people are reacting like the situation I described earlier. It happens quite a bit. So what happens to dialogue? Well, here's the dialogue model again. Well, when we're triggered in this way, safety is threatened, it vanishes. People feel like safety is no longer there. People start fighting or fleeing, which we call in crucial conversations, silence or violence. We either withdraw, flee, silence, or we act in some way that's aggressive, violence. We're not talking about physical violence. I'll give you some examples in a few moments. So people start fighting or fleeing, pushing their ideas into the pool, getting demanding, or withdrawing completely. And the pool shrinks and eventually goes away. And as a result, we lose the ability to find solutions, to create understanding and build stronger relationships. If we can't pull ourselves out of this downward spiral and release our brain from this process, our success, our professional relationships, and our team can really suffer. So how do we stay in dialogue? How do we manage these difficult moments? Well, the first thing we need to do is learn to recognize when it's happening to our feelings. Notice how those things can easily happen and take over our response, and practice some key techniques. And there's 4 I'm going to review with you here today. We're going to start with heart, which is really about starting with your own, looking at yourself, focusing on yourself first, reflecting on your feelings, your motives, and your behavior, and getting clear on what you want. We're going to learn to look, start becoming process observers, noticing what's happening in the conversation. Is it starting to show signs of becoming crucial, either my behavior or the other person's? We're going to learn to get clearer on the story we're telling. That may be driving our emotions and get in the way of dialogue. And we're going to take some steps to make it safe, remembering that safety is the key to the dialogue continuing and to the information continuing to flow. So let's start with heart. In these moments, it's really easy to call the other person the difficult person. And I always like to ask myself, I don't do it right away sometimes, but I try to remember to ask myself, am I being difficult for the other person? Am I the other person's difficult person? So I prefer to actually talk about difficult conversations rather than difficult people, but it's easy for us to label the other person as that. To say, you know, they could do this differently, or if they would just change their behavior, or do things that we try to fix them or change them in some way. And in the process, we might not look at ourselves and see how we fall short. So we might need to put the mirror up in front of ourselves, practice that key skill of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and ask ourselves what we're feeling, what our goals are, and what we're doing. It's really all about me. We've got to focus on me first. Uncover your feelings, and remember that the first thing to degrade in a crucial conversation isn't your behavior. That happens because your motive changed, and that happens because your feelings changed. We have strong feelings. We become blind to them. Our motives degrade and we limit the choices that we think we have. We just drive to what we think the only thing we can do right now is this, push back or interrupt or whatever the case may be. So I got to take responsibility for my own feelings. That requires that self-awareness and that catching ourselves. Because if we don't catch ourselves, if we try to keep talking, if we try to push forward, if we try to change our behavior, chances are it's not going to be successful. It might come across as insincere or shallow. And things can escalate quickly. We can escalate quickly. Daniel Goleman refers to this process, goes on in our brain, as emotional hijacking, getting triggered. Something triggers us, we enter that state of fight or flight, noticing when we're experiencing that, noticing where we experience that in our body, and noticing our feelings. We're stressed, we're angry, we're frustrated, we're threatened, we're upset, we feel disrespected. Paying attention to that is key. Catching ourselves, those feelings will help us be clear on what our motives are for what we're either doing or about to do. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in risky conversations, our motives can shift quickly when our feelings do. Now, here are some of the common healthy motives of dialogue. We want to learn and get information. We want to find the truth. We want to find some solutions, hopefully win-win ones, uncover ones that may be hidden. We want to get results, and we want to strengthen relationships. In dialogue, those are the good goals. Those are the healthy goals. However, when we get into a difficult conversation, these unhealthy motives may emerge. We start to try to look good and save face, or be right, or win, or one-up the other person. We may try to punish, or shame, or blame, criticize, etc. Or we withdraw to avoid conflict or keep the peace. So the key point here is we may start the conversation with one of those healthy motives, but quickly those motives can change and go in a different direction, which are usually visible by what we're doing with our behavior. So what do? How do we get back on track? I grew up with my dad telling me this great line, which I try to use and remember: make sure your brain is in gear before your mouth is in motion. And so these techniques to get our brain back on track and give our frontal cortex a fighting chance to get some blood back and regain control of our brains and our bodies, we want to do a few things. One of the best ways to do that is to ask yourself a question. It forces your frontal cortex to work. And some questions that you can ask are: how am I behaving? What am I acting like I want? If I'm interrupting and getting pushy, perhaps my motive is really about winning and being right. It's not really about learning and understanding. So are my behaviors demonstrating some unhealthy goals? So I want to uncover those unhealthy motives. Another question: okay, so what do I really want? What's my good motive here? What do I really want as the outcome? For me, in conflicts, I try to remember two of them: solve the problem and maintain the relationship. And there's maybe some of the others that you saw on the previous slide: learn, understand, find solutions, etc. So it's really important that we ask ourselves, what do I want for myself, for the other person, for the relationship? Once you've gotten clear on what your motive is, the positive one, then ask yourself, what can I do if I really want that? Make a decision about acting in a way that'll help you get there. If you really, really want that, how would you behave? So here, with this strategy of start with heart, we are focusing on ourselves, focusing on our feelings, paying attention to our behaviors and the motives that those might illustrate, and asking ourselves how we might shift that and behave differently, or what do we really want, and how can we behave differently to get what we want? We can continue this ability to re-engage our brain with the second strategy, which is learn to look. It's paying attention to when safety is at risk. Again, if we don't have safety, people stop contributing to that desired pool of knowledge and pool of shared meaning. So the problem is we may miss or misinterpret the signs, our own and that of the other person. So the best strategy is to catch the situation quickly and pull yourself out, becoming a process observer rather than staying in this fight that you might have started, this argument you might have started. When you step back and say, what's happening here? Another great question to re-engage your frontal cortex. So you can say, okay, what am I seeing? What's going on? Being that process observer is a great way to handle yourself and help the conversation get back to safety and get back on track. So the sooner we notice we're not in dialogue, the quicker we can get back to dialogue and begin to share information again, understand one another, find solutions, and lower the cost of that conversation failing. Noticing those signs first in our own behavior can help us regain control and check our motives and do the start with heart work that we talked about. Noticing them in the other person can help us take a step back and ask ourselves, what do we need to do to recreate safety, which I'll come back to. Here are some common behaviors. When I mentioned silence and violence, silence is any action you take to withhold information from that pool of shared meaning. This can be sarcasm, changing the subject completely, shutting down or withdrawing, avoiding the conversation completely, or talking about something else. So you avoid it by you bring up another conversation. Violence is any action you take to push your meaning into the pool, push your ideas, your perspective. Could be talking over someone, controlling the direction of the conversation, belittling somebody else's ideas, calling them ridiculous, labeling them as, someone like, oh yeah, you're from HR. I'm going to beat up on the HR people. You're from HR. You don't know what you're talking about. So it's labeling, belittling, minimizing the value of what somebody contributes. Could also be personal criticism or attacks. Could also be defending yourself and pushing back because you're protecting yourself, but it's coming across as insisting and pushing your meaning into the pool. The key thing to learn about yourself, and I know there's plenty of conflict assessments out there, but Vital Smarts, which is the group that teaches Crucial Conversations, they actually have a free one on their website. If you Google Crucial Conversations, you'll find Vital Smarts, and you can find an assessment that'll tell you which of these behaviors, the 6 you see on the slide, do you prefer to use or do you commonly use when you get stuck in a crucial conversation. So that's a great one to take a look at, to understand, and so when it's happening, okay, I'm doing this again. What does that tell me? I need to notice, pay attention, start with heart. And again, if the other person is doing any of these things, it might be the moment to step back, to stop focusing on the issue, the ideas, the content of the conversation, and talk about the safety, the process, do things to restore safety that I'll mention here in just a moment. So this is a really key part, is just becoming more aware, becoming a process observer. The third strategy, my favorite one, and I do entire workshops on the concept of the storytelling capacity of our brain. I'm bringing the ladder of inference back up again because I want to remind us what's happening here. We're behaving in a certain way that's driven by our feelings and motives, but that set of feelings is usually the result of the story we're telling about what is happening in the situation, what we're saying about the other person, about the other person's intent. So with this strategy, we're taking another step down the ladder, getting ahead of it, and asking ourselves, what is the story we are telling? Getting clear on that story. Now, one of the ways I like to share this is to share a story, and some of you who attended other workshops on this topic that I've taught have heard the story, so you know how it ends. But I want you to think about how I might have filled in this blank. So several years ago, I was traveling for work a lot, and my husband and Patrick and I had an arrangement where, to avoid my having to pay parking, he would take me to the airport and he would pick me back up when I returned. Since we live about 20 minutes from the Reno Tahoe Airport on the Virginia foothills, we kind of set it up so that, and back then we didn't have the cell phone waiting lot, and he didn't feel like he wanted to hang out there anyway. So what I would do is I would call him when we landed. He'd get in the car and drive to the airport to pick me up. And by the time I'd gotten off the plane, wandered through the airport, gotten my luggage, gotten out to passenger pickup, that was about 20 minutes. It was usually just pretty good on the timing, right? Well, on this particular trip, I was flying back from 3 days of team training in New York with a client, and very early morning starts, 8 o'clock there, because 5 o'clock for me. So it was a pretty tough time change. I flew back through Chicago, and anyone who's ever flown through Chicago, I don't think I've ever left there on time when I've flown through Chicago. So I was about 4 hours delayed. So I was tired and hungry and cranky. Yeah, I was hangry, as they say. We landed. I turned on my phone, called home, and to let my husband know I had landed. The phone rang and eventually went to our home answering machine. I'm sitting there listening to my own voice saying, no one's here right now to answer the phone. So I found myself doing what I had just finished teaching about, and I started filling in this blank. This must mean that blank. This is how we tell the story, and getting clear on how we're filling in this blank can really help. So yeah, I started filling in that blank with a number of different stories. Let's think a little bit about what some of those might be. And for some reason, I can't see the chat box, but somebody can read them out to me. I don't know if Dave or Kevin or Jody, you can read them out to me. But I'd like people to jump in and think, what story might I have told at that moment? My husband did not answer the phone when I called him after I landed. Those are the facts. What's the story I could tell? Is anybody writing anything in? Be creative.
He's watching TV.
He's watching TV.
He gave up on waiting and went to dinner.
Okay.
He forgot.
He forgot?
he's stuck somewhere.
Okay.
This must mean that you forgot. He's on his way.
Okay.
He fell asleep. At least no one said he left you for another woman.
Okay, see, thank you for saying that, Jody, because in
Okay.
every seminar when I tell the story, at least one person always says that. He's with someone else, or he's been in a car accident, he's at home in the hospital, and he can't answer the phone. So you can imagine that any one of these stories would, you think about that ladder of inference. If I told a story like he's with someone else, I'd have a certain set of feelings. If I told the story he was in the hospital, I'd have another set of feelings. If I told the story that he went to Bullies to watch the game with his buddies and he didn't want to pick me up, I'd have a different set of feelings. Now, a lot of that might actually be dependent on what happened in our last conversation. So if we had just had a fight, I might tell a certain story. If I knew he was working in the yard on a house project outside, I would probably have a different story. Again, I could fill that blank with anything. So what really happened? I stood there ready to leave a ghastly message on the answering machine, caught myself and said, Veronica, practice what you teach. So I said, okay, I don't know what to put in that blank. I can't find out. So I'm just going to not leave a message, just going to go get my luggage and figure out how to get home if I have to. So I wandered, got my luggage, went out to the passenger pickup, and sure enough, he drives up. He has actually washed my car. He has flowers for me. He ironed his shirt. That, my friends, is a miracle. He had actually created this whole surprise. He was home when I called. He saw the caller ID. He knew I had landed, so he went straight to the airport because he knew I had taken off, so he knew I had landed. So it was all part of the surprise. Now, imagine if I had left that nasty message, which he could have heard standing there listening to the answering machine. I would have created a difficult conversation that I could have avoided. So I have to remember that when we fill in this blank, we set things up for going in a certain direction. When we fill in this blank, we drive our feelings, and this happens in milliseconds. And so part of what we want to remember is we have a choice about the story we tell. And if you want to change your results, change your story. One of my favorite lines from the Crucial Conversations book. If you want to change your results, change your story. Ask yourself, do I have enough information in this conversation to fill in the blank? Am I telling a story about the other person? What kind of a day am I having? Am I filling it in? Am I being influenced by some difficulty that I'm facing? Remember that 2 words exercise we did before? You filled it in with a variety of things and you went in a different direction. Probably, I don't know if any one of you actually came up with 2 words. Should have asked that, but if anyone did, chime in, and Jody, you can add that to your assessment of who gets the prize at the end of the session today. So basically, you want to catch yourself telling this story, and we do it so quickly, and sometimes we lose sight of the facts. Facts are visible, they're audible, observable in some way. Most people can agree on the facts for the most part. Some of us may focus on some more than others, and we might see them just a little bit differently. But at least we can start there. The stories we tell are judgments, assumptions, and conclusions, and we often tell stories about people's intent. Now, in that situation I mentioned before about interrupting in the meeting when the facilitator didn't respond, there was a fan right behind her and she couldn't hear me. I told a story because I didn't notice all the facts. I didn't pay attention to them. So having all the facts is a really important place to start. So if somebody says to you, we can't do that now, I don't know what their intent is. Maybe their real intent is they don't want to overwhelm the team because the team is pretty overwhelmed right now, so they can't take on something new. But I could tell the story, they just don't like my idea. They just don't want to hear my ideas. They don't want me to bring ideas, and I won't bring them anymore. Again, the facts are what she said. How I respond is based on the story I tell. So what are the facts? What are the facts that I'm focusing on? Did I miss something? Do I have all the facts? Do I have all the information? What assumptions, judgments, or conclusions am I making? Or drawing from the situation, from what I see and hear, from what the person is saying or doing. What other assumptions could I make? And one of my favorite things to ask myself is, okay, I don't know why this person is acting this way or behaving this way or saying what they just said. So ask yourself, why might a reasonable, decent person be acting this way? Just ask yourself that question. It actually helps you humanize the other person. Now, there's 3 clever stories that we often tell. These might sound familiar, and they're somewhat overlapping. There's the victim. Yeah, I'm hopeless, or it's not my fault. You know, I had no other choice. They made me do it, or somebody did something terrible to me. The flip side of that is it's all your fault. You're the bad guy. You did everything wrong. I left you out of the meeting because you behaved badly and you're disruptive and you're a very difficult team member. So that can be turning the other person into villain to justify our behavior. And the last one is woe is me, helpless. I can't do anything here. There is nothing I can do. Now we use these clever stories often, sometimes to justify our own bad behavior, but they don't get us what we want. And actually, sometimes if we do behave badly ourselves, they give the other person the opportunity to tell their own version of this clever story. And there we are, we're stuck. When usually the stories aren't true about either of you. In fact, just yesterday, I was coaching a client and she basically was describing someone she's having a conflict with in such a way that I just used her words back at her. And she made this person out to be this malicious, nefarious person. And when she heard me say it back to her, she stopped and said, okay, maybe that's really not true. And so stopping and asking ourselves, are we turning this person into a villain? Are we turning ourselves into a victim? Maybe we want to ask ourselves, what's the rest of the story? What's the real story? Can we find what the real story is? So if you want to change your results, change the story. What story could you tell that adds information about yourself, about the other person that you might have left out of the first story? First part of that is maybe the story should say a little bit about you, your role in the situation. What have you done or said or not done that's taken you down the path that you go through on right now? Did you misinterpret? Did you overreact? Have you been doing certain behaviors and self-justifying with one of those 3 clever stories I just mentioned? The story should also humanize the other person and try to assume positive intent, that they don't mean to one-up you. They don't mean to shut you down. They don't mean all the terrible things you think that they might mean or that you're experiencing. And so once you catch that, you won't feel quite as threatened. And again, why would a reasonable person be acting this way is a great question to help you humanize the other person. By doing this, you are turning yourself from being a powerless person who doesn't have any ability to act to someone who is able and empowered to act, to be able to ask the question, what should I do right now to move toward what I really want? So again, in this strategy, we are catching our stories because they drive our feelings. We are questioning our assumptions and our conclusions. We're figuring out what's the difference between the facts and the stories. We're looking at the other person's stories perhaps and saying, okay, what story could they tell about me? And what other story could I tell about what's happening here and about the other person? And what new story will empower us to act? Now, with these first 3 strategies, we've been focusing on ourselves, our motives, our behaviors, our stories. Now we turn to the final strategy, how to make it safe. Now remember, dialogue's blocked when safety goes away. And if you see behaviors like we talked about, silence or violence, step back and focus on how can I create safety. You might also want to consider how to do that before even going into the conversation. Now there's 2 things that people need to stay in dialogue and to feel safe. And there may be more, but these are 2 really important ones. They need to feel there's some mutual purpose that involves their goals as well as yours. So there's some positive purpose. They also want to know that your purpose and your intent is not negative or to hurt them or to one-up them or to damage them in some way or threaten them in some way. So they need to know your intent in the conversation is also positive, in addition to respecting and appreciating their goals. Doesn't necessarily mean you agree with them, but that they have space for them. The other one is mutual respect, that you care about them as another human being and that they're worthy of being treated civilly. And so that's really important because when respect stops and you start behaving in some of those aggressive or attacking ways, something very different takes over in the conversation, and it's certainly not safety or trust. So if we have done anything to convey disrespect, one of the first steps that we want to take is to apologize. Or if we think when we go into the conversation, we realize the last conversation, I didn't behave well, and the other person's probably going to have a wall up and be holding a grudge against me, we want to think about how can we apologize when appropriate. So apologies, people hesitate on doing them. And I always feel like the strongest person is the one who apologizes. If you've let something slip from your mouth or attack the other person, step back, offer a sincere apology. My least favorite apologies are the ones, I'm sorry you felt that way, because that is not a real apology. Be willing to give up a small piece of your ego, but you'll gain a bit of character, rebuild respect and trust, and reopen the possibility of dialogue. Once we've done this, we can move forward and help the other person dialogue with you, share their story, be more receptive to you, and hear your ideas as well. The other thing we want to do to create safety, and do this even before going into the conversation, even anticipate maybe they're going to react a certain way. How can I preempt that or mitigate that? So set the tone up front. So think about what are the other person's goals, their possible reactions, about their interpretations of your intent, or maybe from other conversations you've had. So we want to start the conversation by articulating the positive overarching purpose of having the conversation. Things like, your development is important to me. Working together matters to me. Increasing your level of contribution to the team will accelerate your success or progress. You could identify a team benefit, things like, you and I are both committed to our team meeting the project milestones and hitting our metrics. You can find a common goal there to start with. And you'll see we might need to return to that several times if the conversation starts to get sticky. You could also use, if you anticipate that they might hear you in a way that you don't intend, you could use what's called a contrasting statement, where you explain what you're not doing and you explained what you are doing, what you don't intend, followed by what you do intend. For example, I'm not suggesting that I don't value your work. I think you do high quality work. I do want to talk with you about my concerns regarding your punctuality. Or I don't want to suggest this problem is yours. I think it's ours. I don't want to put the burden all on you. What I do want is to be able to talk so we understand each other better and work better together. So you do the don't, what you don't intend, and the do, what you do intend, if you anticipate that the other person is going to hear your intention wrong, or if you perceive in the middle of the conversation when they're getting defensive or aggressive or withdrawing, or you see signs, you realize they're hearing me the wrong way. They're interpreting it, my intent, the wrong way. You might use some of these techniques. Then you want to share your facts and your story. You're going to share what you noticed, what the facts are, and you're going to say it in a way that opens the door to feedback, as you'll see in a moment. Share your reasoning process. Talk about the ladder of inference, what facts you focused on, the story you told about them, your assumptions, your conclusions, and what you think that leads you to want to do. Again, if you're giving them feedback about their behavior, let the facts be about observable behavior, not you were rude in the meeting, but you rolled your eyes when I spoke twice during the meeting and interrupted me and said my idea was ridiculous. That's factual, observable behavior, not you're a jerk, or you were rude, or some other descriptor that could provoke defensiveness and certainly not lead to a helpful conversation. Use I statements, because you statements generally provoke pushback and defensiveness. Talk about what the impact is on you. So you could say, when you rolled your eyes, I felt disrespected and feel like you don't value my opinions. I'm using I statements to own it. You could also say things like, can I tell you how I got to this conclusion? You can open it up that way. You can ask a question to say, can I share with you my experience of what happened? Doesn't mean you don't talk about your assumptions. You own them and you can share them, and maybe they will correct you or see it differently. And that's why we invite feedback. We ask them questions like, is there something I'm missing or overlooking, or that you're seeing differently? We want to make it two-way, because if I just come at them and say, hey, Dave, you rolled your eyes twice in the meeting and cut me off and said my idea was ridiculous, and I stop, he's probably going to think Veronica's just venting at me. But if I say, what happened for you, or how do you see it? It's going to make it more of a two-way dialogue that might open the door to helping understand each other. Maybe it'll allow Dave to say, you know what, I was having a hard moment. I shouldn't have done that. And the story is over at that point. So we want to invite feedback to help them challenge even our story and the way we see things or what we've experienced, and to understand us better and help us unpack our thinking. Then we want to open the door to understanding their stories. Ask questions. When you show someone that you care about their views and that you have a sincere interest in their goals, experience, and perspectives, they will participate and add more to the pool of shared meaning. Asking good questions conveys respect, which strengthens trust and therefore safety. It allows people to learn things that, both of us to learn things we might not have known, or we might have missed, facts that we overlooked. I hear a lot of my clients say, I don't know why the other person does that. And the question I ask is, well, have you asked them? Have you asked them, what's going on for you, or why might you be acting that way? I always say use why questions carefully with a very careful tone of voice, because the key to good questions is that they be open, using what or how, not did you understand that or do you agree? It's what happened for you? How do you think we can work that out? And neutral questions that don't convey a judgment. Instead of, why would you think that? Ask, please tell me how you got to that conclusion. Or I'd like to understand more about your interest in that idea. So one of my favorite lines when we talk about asking questions is, don't get furious, get curious. This can really help us in that moment where we feel those feelings, we're catching our story, and if you don't know what to do at that moment, ask a question. Don't get furious, find out more. So don't get furious, get curious. I hope that's one of the gems. That's not from Crucial Conversations. I think that one's from my dad as well. So you're getting a couple of my dadisms here today, but he was a wise man. So after we ask questions, we want to listen. Use good listening skills. Stop talking. Don't just rebut or push back. Listen, ask more questions. Listen for their facts. Listen for their story and their feelings. Be willing to explore that story further by asking additional questions. Reflect back what you hear to confirm that you understand and ask them, did I get it right? And the other one is monitor that dialogue in your head. When we're in difficult conversations, we spend a lot of time planning ahead on what we're going to say to rebut what the other person is saying to us. That means we're not listening. So if you can catch that mental arguing that's going on and assume that curious position and ask more questions, it's really interesting that the uncanny truth of dialogue is the person who asks the most questions and listens actually guides the flow of the conversation. Remember that. And once you have more information in the pool from them and from you, you can then move forward to finding clearer agreement of what the issue is, from there discussing options and solutions, and then making decisions and hopefully moving forward on those. And finally, at any point during the conversation, you could see signs reemerge that safety is at risk. So commit to continuing to seek mutual purpose. Keep reiterating it and ask the how can we questions. How can we do this? How can we do that? Find a both and way to put out the problem. Like, how can we get what's important to you and what's important to me? So how can we meet this deadline and stay within the cost parameters that are of concern to you? So make a commitment to serve not only your goals and interests, but theirs as well. So things like, I understand that developing a process that is cost effective is very important to you. I'm committed to that as well. How can we find one that we can use in this situation or at this level of quality or with this time parameter? So those are that you do a both and rather than an either or. And one of my favorites to reiterate mutual purpose is, how can we work together to get the results that I know are important to you and to me? So keep doing that, especially when things start to get unsafe. Don't keep driving toward the issue where the idea is take a step back and ask a question, acknowledge what's happening. Even say things like, I want us to have a positive working relationship. I know we're having this conversation to help us get there. I want both of us to be successful. Finding a solution will help us do that. It's important to me. I know it's important to you. So in those unsafe moments or when you see those signs of lack of safety, try pulling out some of those. So step out of the content, focus on the safety, use some of these techniques to try to rebuild some of that safety. So that's some of the best practices and key strategies from Crucial Conversations. And I have summed them up in a handy dandy little tool that I'm going to send to you that I've put together for my clients. I have it hanging on my wall right here. It's the way that I've put it together over the years, and I find that it's a useful way to remember some of these techniques. The first one is stop, pause, breathe, check in with yourself. Ask yourself, how are you feeling? What are you doing? How are you behaving? How's the other person behaving, perhaps? And take a deep breath. The reflection. This is where you get your brain in gear. You ask the questions. What do I really want? What are my motives and goals? What story am I telling? How might I assume the best of the other person? And why might a reasonable, decent person be acting this way? And then once you've identified what your goal is and a healthy motive, decide on a course of action. What might I say or do that will help me get to my goals? How would I behave if I really did want those things? Then behave that way. And remember, safety first. Take a step back, ask questions, listen. Remember, the other person's not going to work to find solutions with you until you take the time to listen to them. I'm going to send you that tool. It's a big stop sign, and on the back are some alternate stories that you can tell in those triggered moments. Things like reminding you, don't get furious, get curious. And why would a reasonable person be acting this way? And this person must be having a really hard day to be acting like this. In fact, I'll just share this with you. When I was teaching my daughter how to drive, I told her that when people cut you off on the highway, you can get worked up. And what I do is when people cut me off on the highway, I send them a blessing because I figure they've got a sick relative in the hospital and they're trying to get there fast. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's a story I can tell. I don't know what the real story is, but why not tell that one? It doesn't increase my blood pressure. It allows me to have some compassion, and it allows me to let it go. So remember, get curious, listen, find out more about what you don't know. I'll send you that tool. Many have asked me if using these tools makes the conversation longer. And the irony of dialogue is that slower is faster. Taking the time to increase dialogue, to fill that pool, it leads to more effective solutions. Dialogue takes time, but the alternatives take longer and cost more. So when we shift our purpose from winning our way to adding to the shared pool of knowledge and shared meaning, we give up trying to convince and become more convincing. And these benefits of being able to dialogue will help you, your teams, and your organizations. So I want you to just take a quick moment, reflect back to that situation you identified earlier, and see if any of these tools might have helped you if you're looking back at a previous situation, or if you're in one now, what's something you want to take with you and take forward? And if you want to share something in the chat box about what you're taking forward, I'd be willing to do that. That would be great. And again, Jody, if you can tell me what people write in, that would be great.
Sorry, I had to find myself to unmute myself. Okay, so Gail said, great, wow, lots of great information. Reflecting more rather than being quick to react. When the client owes me money, I feel weird. Thank you, Lou.
You talked about the car situation. What about road rage when people flip you the finger, you know what I mean?
What I try to do is like, you know what, this person must be really having a bad day to be acting this way. Sometimes I even expand it to this person must have been really have a hard life to think that kind of behavior is okay. Like that's what they've learned, that they don't know any better. I can take it on and make it mine and make it personal, but it also helps to tell the story that it's about them. It's not about me.
It's hard to retain, calmness in that situation. I've actually tempered it and I blow them a kiss.
Wow.
And it worked. And
the last slide was basically my information. I want to make sure that everybody has my email address if they'd like to contact me, but I will stop screen sharing. Well, if you want, and like I said, if you want a longer version of this and a lot more time to get into it and practice it and try it out, there is a class at Extended Studies. It's a 6-hour class. I've actually offered in October, and and you actually do get the book, Crucial Conversations, as part of the class too.
So thank you all for being here. And Veronica, thank you. That was so good. I think all of us too often face difficult conversations. That was great information to help deal with those.
Thanks, having
Veronica.
me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great job, Veronica, as always.
Thanks, Veronica.
Thank you. Great
Thanks,
job.
everybody.
Thank you.